Queen Elizabeth. I wasn't just a queen, she was a walking legend. She called herself the Virgin Queen, wore fancy dresses covered in jewels, and ruled with a sharp mind and strong hand. People remember her for her powerful court, beating the Spanish Armada and making England a strong Protestant country. But behind all that beauty and power, under the thick makeup and shiny pearls, was a woman full of fear, pride, and obsession. She cared deeply about how others saw her, and when it came to staying clean, things got really strange. Back then, hygiene wasn't about staying healthy. It was about looking good, and Queen Elizabeth turned it into a kind of performance. She thought water could make her sick. She was so afraid of getting old, she treated her body like something sacred, something that couldn't be touched by time or even by soap. We will explore 5 of the weirdest and most shocking things Queen Elizabeth I did to stay clean. And the last one, you won't believe it. Elizabeth had a powerful addiction, sugar. At the time, sugar was not something everyone could afford. It was rare, expensive, and came all the way from far-off lands. Most people might never taste it in their lifetime, but for the Queen of England, it was everywhere. She didn't just enjoy sweets, she drowned in them. Her royal meals included candied violets, sugar-covered fruits, sweet almond marzipan, and desserts soaked in syrup. To have sugar was to show off your status. Elizabeth didn't just eat it, she used it to show off England's growing power and wealth. But this sweet obsession came with a terrible cost. In the 1500s, dental care was primitive. Toothbrushes were rough, and most people cleaned their teeth with twigs, rags, or crushed eggshells. The Queen, however, had her own special mix. A homemade toothpaste made of sugar and herbs. Yes, sugar. The very thing rotting her teeth was the same thing she used to try to clean them. To make it worse, she also used gritty powders that scratched away her tooth enamel. Over time, her once royal smile turned into something shocking. Foreign visitors noticed it. By the 1590s, her teeth were black, broken, or missing entirely. Her breath was said to be so foul, it made people around her physically uncomfortable. And sometimes her words were hard to understand because she was speaking through a mouth of rot. Yet she refused to let doctors pull them out. Elizabeth was known to be stubborn and terrified of pain. To convince her it wasn't deadly, one of her courtiers even volunteered to have a tooth pulled in front of her. Imagine that. Someone willingly screaming in agony just to get the Queen to open her mouth. But perhaps the strangest part was what happened next. Rather than mock her decaying teeth, the noblewomen in her court copied them. That's right, they blackened their own teeth with soot and charcoal to match the Queen's look. In her court, even tooth decay became a symbol of class. If the Queen had black teeth, then black teeth meant beauty, power, and wealth. The darker your smile, the richer you must be. In a world where everything the Queen did became fashion, even rotting teeth became desirable. That's the power of royalty. You may have heard the shocking quote, "I bathe once a month whether I need it or not." Some say Queen Elizabeth I really said it. Others say it's just a legend. But either way, it shows how people thought about cleanliness in the 1500s and how strange it was compared to today. Back then, water was seen as dangerous. People believed it could carry illness, weaken the body, and let in bad air, something they called miasma. This invisible poison was blamed for spreading deadly diseases like the plague. To many, taking a bath wasn't healthy, it was risky, so Queen Elizabeth avoided it. Instead of washing with soap and water, she had a different routine. She would change her linen underclothes, called shifts, sometimes several times a day. People believed that the soft fabric pulled sweat, dirt, and toxins out of the skin. No water needed, just fresh fabric. When she did freshen up, she used rosewater, vinegar, or herbal mixes made by her royal apothecaries. These were gently dabbed onto her skin by handmaids. It was a slow, careful ritual, not for hygiene, but for appearances. Her body was treated more like a sacred object than a human one. It had to stay perfect at all costs. Why not just take a real bath? Because that was no small task. Her palaces had no plumbing, no running water. If she wanted a bath, it meant dragging out a giant wooden tub, heating dozens of buckets of water, and calling in at least 3 servants to pour, stir, and prepare. It was like planning a royal ceremony. Bathing was a luxury, not a habit, and yet people called her clean. She wore hundreds of gowns made of fine silk and velvet. She smelled like flowers and spices. She kept perfumed gloves, scented handkerchiefs, and demanded her appearance be flawless from head to toe. But all of this created an illusion of cleanliness, not real sanitation. There was no scrubbing, no rinsing, no soap. Elizabeth didn't avoid bathing because she was dirty or lazy. She avoided it because too much reality could ruin her perfect image. Water could smudge her white makeup. It could soften the illusion. It could make her human. And in her mind, a queen was not supposed to be human. Queen Elizabeth's face is one of the most famous in history, white as porcelain, smooth like a statue, and cold as stone. But that wasn't her real skin. It was a mask, carefully painted every day, not for beauty, but for power. In her time, pale skin meant wealth, class, and even a sign from God. The whiter you were, the higher you stood, so the queen took it to the extreme. She didn't just wear makeup, she used it to build a myth, a perfect version of herself that could never grow old or weak. Her favorite product was Venetian ceruse, a deadly mix of white lead and vinegar. It created a flawless look, hiding every blemish, scar, and shadow. But underneath, it was eating her alive. This poison soaked into her skin, causing rashes, open sores, and long-term scarring. As her real face was slowly destroyed, she simply added more layers of makeup, thicker and thicker, until her appearance became a frozen mask. But it didn't stop there. For her lips, she used bright red colors made from mercury, one of the most toxic substances on Earth. The more she used it, the sicker she became. Her mood changed, her memory faded, her body weakened, and her hands sometimes trembled. These are classic signs of mercury poisoning, and the queen had no idea she was poisoning herself every time she painted her face. So why keep doing it? Because her face didn't just belong to her, it belonged to England. Her image was her power. It made her seem ageless, godlike, untouchable. She didn't allow painters to show her real features. Instead, artists had to use official face patterns, copied from younger portraits. No matter how old she got, her paintings stayed the same. Youthful, perfect, eternal. She even refused to be seen in natural light. Candles and shadows helped hide the truth. In her final years, her face became so delicate, people whispered that touching it could cause the makeup to crack and fall apart. She barely washed her face. Why would she? Washing it meant wiping away the illusion and revealing a fragile, aging woman beneath the mask of the Virgin Queen. Did she know the makeup was killing her? Historians still debate it, but one thing is clear. She chose the mask over her health. She was willing to destroy her body to keep the legend of Gloriana alive. To truly understand Queen Elizabeth's hygiene, you need to understand her deepest fear: losing control. Every inch of her body, her painted face, perfumed gloves, and carefully chosen scents was not just about looking good. It was about holding power and hiding weakness. In her time, bathing wasn't just rare, it was risky. People believed water could carry disease, and bathing meant exposing your body, both physically and symbolically. It was seen as soft, intimate, even dangerous. And Elizabeth, who had witnessed her mother Anne Boleyn be destroyed by the court, would not allow herself to appear fragile. To her, a naked body was a vulnerable body, so she avoided water and built a new form of cleanliness, one made of perfume and ritual. Every day she surrounded herself with strong, sweet smells. Her maids prepared rose water, lavender oil, vinegar infusions, and herbal mixtures brewed in the palace's still rooms. These liquids weren't meant to clean the skin. They were meant to cover odor and create the illusion of freshness. A few drops behind the ears, a wipe on the wrists, a fragrant handkerchief tucked in her sleeve, and she would drift through her court like a walking flower garden, untouched by human scent. She carried pomanders, small ornate balls filled with herbs and resins, hidden in her dress or worn on her belt. Whenever a foul odor crept too close, she would lift one to her nose and breathe in the controlled world she had built. These objects weren't just for comfort, they were a clear message. I am not like you. I do not stink like the rest of the world. Even her clothing was part of the performance. Her gloves were perfumed, her handkerchiefs soaked in oils, and her dresses layered and stiff, designed to hide her body and trap scent. She was known to give out scented gloves to her courtiers, a gift that didn't come from her skin but from her image. As for her hair, it was rarely washed. Washing it was seen as dangerous, especially for someone who wore so much makeup. Instead, her real hair was stiffened with sugar water and egg whites, then powdered. As she aged and began to lose hair, likely from years of lead and mercury poisoning, she switched to wigs, especially auburn ones, to keep up her image. But underneath all that powder and perfume, her body was falling apart. Years of toxic makeup had left her skin scarred, thin, and blistered. Rumors spread of peeling skin, open sores, and a face too damaged to touch, and yet she kept painting it thicker and thicker. She even banned mirrors from her private rooms. No one was allowed to see the truth, not even herself. It said she had a servant, whose only job was to powder her shoulders in private, to make sure no one ever saw her real skin. Elizabeth had become a prisoner of her own illusion. From the outside, Queen Elizabeth II's palaces looked like heaven on earth. Massive stone walls, golden ceilings, velvet carpets, and halls filled with music and silk. But take one step past the royal image, and you'd find something far less glamorous. There were no toilets, no sinks, no plumbing. That's right. Behind all the beauty, the Queen lived in a world that smelled like a sewer. Her most private toilet was a fancy wooden chair called a close stool. It looked elegant on the outside, but under the cushion was just a ceramic pot for collecting waste. It had to be emptied by hand, cleaned and perfumed multiple times a day. And it wasn't done by just any servant. It was done by someone with royal power, the groom of the stool. Don't let the job title fool you. This man was no janitor. He was a trusted noble, chosen for loyalty and secrecy. He didn't just help the Queen use the toilet. He also helped her get dressed, managed private matters, and sometimes even shared secret political conversations. In the strange world of the Tudor court, being close to the Queen during her most personal moments meant being close to power. The rest of the palace, however, was far more disgusting. There were no flushing toilets, just chamber pots, buckets, or bowls for waste, used by everyone. These were dumped into cesspits hidden beneath floors, or just outside palace walls. The job of cleaning all this waste fell to men called gong farmers, or night soil men. They worked at night, carrying buckets of human waste through dark hallways and narrow stairs, trying not to spill as they emptied the filth into open trenches. The smell was awful, and it never really went away. To cover it up, the palace burned herbs like lavender, rosemary, and sweet marjoram. People sprinkled flowers on the floors and laid down straw or rushes, soaked in oils, to try to trap the odor. But these rushes weren't cleaned often. Dirt, hair, crumbs, and rot built up underneath, creating a hidden layer of filth. Even the Queen couldn't escape the stink. She moved her court from palace to palace, not just for politics, but to escape the smell. The longer she stayed in one place, the worse the waste problem became. No amount of perfume could hide the truth forever. This was the true face of royal life, a world of gold and velvet on the outside, but decay and disease underneath. A place where power sat beside filth, where the most powerful woman in England lived in a constant battle with the smell of her own kingdom. Queen Elizabeth didn't rule by accident. She ruled with strategy, style, and smoke and mirrors. Her hygiene wasn't lazy, it was intentional. Every skipped bath, every drop of rose water, every powdered wig was part of a grand performance. In a world where a woman's strength could be torn apart by a single rumor, Elizabeth made herself into something untouchable, ageless, and beyond human. She knew the truth. To bathe was to risk the mask. Water could wash away her power. A bare face might invite judgment. A real, aging body could destroy the illusion she had spent decades perfecting. So instead, she powdered, she perfumed, she painted, she posed, and she became a legend. Elizabeth I may not have been clean by today's standards, but she was flawless by design. In her world, soap and water were not tools of health, they were threats to power. She didn't just survive, she mastered the art of being seen without being known. In the end, her true cleanliness was not on her skin. It was in her image. And for a queen, image was everything. It was a cold November morning in 1326, and the marketplace in Hereford was overflowing not with trade, but with bloodthirsty anticipation. Nobles, priests, commoners, all gathered shoulder to shoulder to witness a spectacle unlike anything they'd ever seen. On a raised wooden platform, a gaunt, hollow-eyed man was dragged before them. Once the second most powerful figure in all of England, trusted by the king, feared by the court, he was now reduced to a symbol of betrayal, corruption, and forbidden intimacy. His name was Hugh Despenser the Younger. Within moments, he would endure one of the most gruesome executions in English history, castrated, disemboweled, and torn limb from limb before a cheering crowd. But why? What had this man done to deserve such a fate? Was he merely a greedy manipulator who clawed his way to the top, or was he something more dangerous, the lover of a king? This is not just a story of power and punishment. It's a story of obsession, political theater, sexual scandal, and the brutal price of ambition. To understand how Hugh Despenser rose so high and fell so horrifically, we have to go back to a kingdom cracking under pressure, a monarch craving loyalty, and a court where whispers could kill. This is the rise and fall of the king's favorite. Hugh Despenser was born around 1286 into a family of high status. His father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, was a respected noble and a loyal servant to King Edward III. His mother, Isabel de Beauchamp, came from a powerful lineage. Her father was the Earl of Warwick. From birth, Hugh had influence in his blood. He was raised in the corridors of power, schooled in courtly etiquette, warfare, and the intricate dance of noble politics. But Hugh wasn't content to be just another aristocrat. He was ambitious, calculating, and had a hunger for more than titles or estates. He wanted power. That chance came in 1307 when Edward II took the throne. Edward was a king unlike his father. Where Edward I was a fierce warrior and strict ruler, Edward II was more emotionally driven, and he had a clear weakness for certain men. His first favorite, Piers Gaveston, had scandalized the court with his swagger and his arrogant hold over the king. The nobility loathed him. In 1312, they took matters into their own hands and murdered him. With Gaveston gone, a vacuum opened, and Hugh Despenser saw his opportunity. By 1318, Hugh had become a trusted confidant of the king. He was appointed royal chamberlain, a position that gave him direct and daily access to Edward. This wasn't just ceremonial. In medieval courts, whoever controlled the king's ear controlled the country, and Hugh played the game masterfully. He married Eleanor de Clare, the king's niece, tying himself directly to the royal family and gaining vast lands in Glamorgan, Wales. With each year, his influence grew, but so did his greed. Hugh wasn't subtle about his ambition. He began seizing lands, sometimes through shady legal maneuvering, sometimes through outright extortion. He even forced his own sister-in-law to hand over valuable property. When a baronial revolt forced Edward to exile Hugh in 1321, you might think that would be the end of it, but not for Hugh. While in exile, he turned pirate. Yes, pirate, attacking English merchant ships like some medieval mob boss with a grudge. By 1322, Edward II had put down the rebellion and brought Hugh back into favor. But this time, it wasn't just favor, it was absolute dominance. Between 1322 and 1326, Hugh and his father weren't just influencing the crown, they were the crown. They effectively ran the government, controlling land, money, justice, and even access to the king himself. One chronicler put it bluntly, Hugh Despenser was King of England in all but name. Naturally, this didn't sit well with the rest of the nobility, or with Queen Isabella. Isabella of France, Edward II's wife, had long been sidelined by Hugh's growing power. Her finances were restricted, her household was dismantled, and worst of all, her own children were taken from her and placed in the care of Hugh's wife. It wasn't just personal, it was war, and Isabella would soon find her general. In 1325, she was sent to France to negotiate a treaty on behalf of her husband. There she met Roger Mortimer, a rebellious baron who had escaped from the Tower of London and fled to the continent. Mortimer was charismatic, shrewd, and most importantly, furious at Hugh Despenser. He and Isabella became lovers and co-conspirators. Together they plotted the unthinkable, the overthrow of a sitting English king and the total destruction of the Despensers. In September 1326, they invaded England with a modest army of foreign mercenaries. What they didn't expect, but what worked entirely in their favor, was the speed at which the English nobility turned on Edward II. Years of Despenser abuse had built up an ocean of resentment. Now that resentment came crashing down. Edward, Hugh the Younger, and Hugh the Elder panicked and fled west, dragging the royal treasury with them. But they didn't get far. Hugh the Elder was captured in Bristol. His execution was swift and brutal, hanged while still in his armor, then beheaded and quartered. Edward II and Hugh the Younger tried to escape into Wales, but their time had run out. They were captured near Neath in November. Edward would soon be imprisoned and forced to abdicate the throne in favor of his teenage son, the future Edward III. But for Hugh Despenser, there would be no prison cell, no exile, no mercy. He tried to starve himself to death before his trial, refusing food in a desperate attempt to avoid the fate he knew was coming. But his body held on just long enough for the executioners. On November 24, 1326, under the watchful eyes of Queen Isabella, Roger Mortimer, and a blood-hungry crowd, Hugh Despenser the Younger was sentenced. The charges: treason, theft, corruption, manipulation of the king, and abuse of power. But the trial was just a formality. His execution had already been decided not only as punishment, but as political theater. What followed would go down as one of the most horrific punishments in English history. The execution of Hugh Despenser the Younger wasn't just about death, it was about a message. This wasn't a quick hanging or a quiet beheading. This was a performance designed to horrify, humiliate, and warn, and it began early that cold November morning in Hereford. Guards dragged Hugh through the town in front of a roaring crowd. He was tied to a tall ladder so that even those in the furthest corners of the marketplace could see his agony. On his head, the executioners placed a crown of nettles, a twisted mockery of royal authority, a parody of the power he once held. To make things even more symbolic, passages from the Bible condemning pride and wickedness were scrawled across his skin. It was a gruesome sermon, played out not with words but with flesh and fire. Then came the real torment. According to the chronicler, Jean Froissart, the executioners began by cutting off Hugh's genitals and throwing them into a fire right before his eyes. This act wasn't chosen at random. It was meant to punish what many believed was his sexual relationship with Edward II, what the church at the time called sodomy, considered not only a sin, but an attack on the natural and divine order. And the spectacle didn't stop there. While Hugh was still conscious, his abdomen was sliced open. Slowly, agonizingly, his entrails were pulled out and tossed into the same fire. The crowd, far from being shocked, cheered. Some described the sound Hugh made as an inhuman howl, a cry of pure torment that echoed across the square. Only after this extended torture was he finally hanged. And even that wasn't the end. His body was beheaded and quartered, literally cut into 4 pieces. Each part was sent to a different corner of England to be displayed as a warning. His head was placed on a stake at the gates of London. It was as much a political message as a punishment. The fall of Hugh Despenser wasn't just the story of one man's downfall. It was about cleansing the kingdom. The public castration, in particular, was soaked in symbolism. It wasn't just a punishment for crimes. It was a public ritual designed to erase and avenge what many saw as an unnatural influence over the king. It sent a message. This is what happens when you defy God, law, and order. And yet, despite the spectacle, there was one final strange echo of mercy. 4 years later, in December 1330, Hugh's widow, Eleanor de Clare, was granted permission to recover what was left of him. She was able to bury the few remaining fragments of his body at the family estate in Gloucestershire. All they could find were his head, a femur, and some scraps of bone. A pathetic end for a man who had once ruled England in all but name. But this story doesn't end with Hugh, because the man he had devoted himself to, Edward II, would meet a fate that was just as disturbing. After being forced to abdicate the throne in favor of his 14-year-old son, Edward II was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle. At first, he was kept alive, a disgraced former king hidden from the world. But that was too dangerous. In September 1327, less than a year after Hugh's death, Edward II was murdered. And the method? According to the most infamous version of the story, one repeated for centuries, he was killed by having a red-hot poker thrust into his rectum, a way to leave no outward scars while still delivering a message as brutal as Hugh's death, a final symbolic punishment for their supposed relationship. Modern historians debate the truth of that account. Some believe it may have been invented later as a piece of propaganda. Others think it's plausible, given the tone of political vengeance that defined the time. Either way, the symbolism stuck. It's clear that what happened to Hugh and Edward was about more than just crime and punishment. It was about reshaping the narrative of power. Who had it, who abused it, and how they would be remembered. And perhaps most ironically, the very people who orchestrated Hugh's downfall didn't hold on to power for long. Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer, once hailed as liberators, soon became tyrants in their own right. Mortimer, now effectively running the country through the young Edward III, ruled with an arrogance and favoritism that began to mirror the exact same corruption he'd overthrown. By 1330, Edward III, now 17, had had enough. In a daring coup, he seized control of the throne, had Mortimer arrested and tried for treason. Mortimer was executed, hanged, but spared the tortures inflicted on Hugh. The wheel of power had turned once again. Centuries later, the story of Hugh Despenser continues to provoke horror, fascination, and reflection. In a modern poll, he was voted one of the greatest villains of the 14th century, and even earned a spot on some lists of the worst Britons of all time. His life has been reimagined in novels, plays, and historical dramas, often casting him as the ultimate court manipulator, greedy, ruthless, and seductive. But there's another layer to this story. For generations, the hatred directed at Hugh and Edward was shaped by deep-seated homophobia and religious morality. Accusations of sodomy weren't just about sex, they were tools of political destruction. In medieval society, labeling someone as morally corrupt often meant targeting their most intimate relationships. Even historians offer a more balanced view. While Hugh was undoubtedly manipulative and insatiably greedy, the extent of his relationship with Edward remains uncertain. Was it romantic, sexual, platonic, but unusually close? We'll probably never know. What's certain is that whatever bond they shared, it was used as a weapon by their enemies. Their story, especially the violence of their downfall, reveals how fear of sexuality and obsession with control shaped the brutal politics of medieval England. And that brings us to something larger, the nature of justice itself. Hugh's execution wasn't just punishment, it was theater, a lesson written in blood and flame. His body became a billboard for political order, his death a carefully choreographed spectacle to cleanse the kingdom. It's tempting to look back and think of those times as primitive. But are we really so different? Even today, when someone powerful falls, it's not always enough that they're punished. Often, we want to see it. We want the spectacle. We want the headlines, the public shaming, the fall from grace. The platforms may have changed, but the instincts remain. Hugh Despenser's story, in all its gruesome and tragic detail, is more than just a tale of medieval brutality. It's a chilling reminder of how power, desire, and politics can collide with catastrophic consequences. He wasn't born a monster. He was born into privilege, yes, but also into expectation, to serve, to rise, to prove his worth in a world where nobility was everything, but safety was nothing. In another life, perhaps Hugh might have been remembered simply as a nobleman, a loyal servant of the crown. But he didn't stop there. His rise was meteoric, fast, aggressive, and unapologetic. He used every tool at his disposal: his royal marriage, his closeness to the king, his manipulation of the law, his appetite for land and wealth. And it worked until it didn't. The same force that elevated him, his intimate bond with King Edward II, was the one that ultimately dragged him to destruction. And that's the part of the story that still echoes today, because what made Hugh Despenser so hated wasn't just the corruption or the power hoarding. It was that his enemies believed he had disrupted the natural order, politically, morally, and sexually. In a deeply patriarchal, theocratic society like 14th century England, where the church and nobility shared a rigid moral code, a man like Hugh, perceived to be wielding influence through seduction and sin, was more than a nuisance. He was an existential threat. The execution made sure everyone understood that. It wasn't about legal justice. It was about purging, about burning out the perceived corruption, literally and figuratively, in front of a cheering crowd, a kingdom cleansing itself with fire and rope. The fear behind all that spectacle, it wasn't just about Hugh, it was about the idea of Hugh. The idea that someone outside the accepted molds of power and propriety could ascend so high, and do it through emotional or erotic intimacy with the king, sent shivers down the spine of every noble bishop and baron in the land. It made the rigid social structure feel vulnerable, and medieval England did not like to feel vulnerable. So they made an example out of him, the ultimate example. But as with so many stories in history, the wheel didn't stop turning. The regime that brought Hugh down, Isabella and Mortimer, collapsed within just 4 years. The young Edward III, perhaps watching all of this unfold with sharp eyes and clenched fists, seized power for himself. He had Mortimer executed, and his mother, Queen Isabella, quietly sidelined, never tried, never punished, but stripped of her power. The boy king had learned the lesson well. Let no one else rule in your place. Let no favorite, no lover, no regent take your crown. The irony is bitter. Hugh had risen to power by filling the void left by an insecure king. Mortimer had done the same, and both paid the price. Nearly 700 years later, we still remember Hugh Despenser, not because of noble deeds or acts of bravery, but because of the extremity of his downfall. He became a symbol, a warning, a grotesque lesson carved into the flesh of history. And yet, in modern times, his legacy is more complicated. Historians today are re-evaluating the medieval narrative. They acknowledge that Hugh was greedy, manipulative, and corrupt, but they also question whether his vilification was amplified by politics, homophobia, and religious hysteria. Accusations of sodomy were used often in medieval Europe as a way to discredit enemies. You didn't need proof, you just needed a crowd willing to believe. And once that seed was planted, it grew into something ugly, something fatal. So perhaps the real lesson of Hugh Despenser isn't just that power corrupts, it's that power, when tied to identity, when filtered through the lenses of sex, love, and taboo, becomes especially dangerous. Not dangerous because of what it is, but because of what others fear it might represent. In Hugh's case, it represented a disruption of order, of gender roles, of royal hierarchy, of masculinity itself. And for that, the punishment had to be theatrical, symbolic, unforgettable. Even now in popular culture, he's often portrayed not just as a villain but as a seducer, a shadow king, the whisperer in Edward's ear. It's fascinating and telling that the most enduring part of Hugh's identity isn't his politics or his violence, but his proximity to the king's heart. That's what makes his story so compelling and so unsettling. It's a mirror not just into the past, but into ourselves. Because if we strip away the medieval costumes, the scaffolds, the swords, and the fire, we're left with something very human. A man who wanted power, a king who wanted love, a court that wanted order, and a society that needed someone to blame. And when those forces collided, they didn't just destroy a man, they created a legend, a myth soaked in blood, cruelty, and fear. So the next time we hear about someone being torn down in public, on TV, online, or in the court of opinion, we might pause and remember Hugh Despenser. Not to excuse his crimes, but to recognize the machinery that crushes those who fall out of favor. The spectacle, the ritual. Because history doesn't just repeat, it performs. And we, the audience, still gather in the square, only now the platforms are digital and the scaffolds are made of headlines. Hugh Despenser's mutilated body was scattered to the four winds, but his story remains. Not as a morality tale, not as a celebration of justice, but as a warning about power, about proximity, about the cost of becoming too close to the throne, and about how, in every age, medieval or modern, there is always a price to pay when you dare to hold it all.